Okay, hello everybody. My name's Jackie Boyle, and I'm part of the Igalen Fab Five, and I've got five of us on here today, which is a pleasure for all of us. So we've got Debbie Ward, Lee Rafferty, and we've got the esteemed Dr. Ken Pepperdine, and also Dr. Ron Bosema Senior. So we're very lucky to have them on board, and today I'm pretty excited about the topic that we're going to be talking about, and we're looking into one of the most, I believe, one of the most valuable commodities that we have, which are our children. But as our children grow, we're going into the teenage years and into young adulthood, and looking at the environmental changes that they're exposed to, and what happens to their body as they're going through that transition period as well, and what can occur for them, but also looking back into the benefits of the Igalen products with Emulan and Climax and how they can play a role in their lives. So that's what our topic is today with Dr. Ken and Dr. Ron. So I'd like to hand it over to them and welcome them, and we'll get started from there.
Thanks, Jackie.
Pleasure.
Are you there, Ron?
I'm here. Oh, yeah.
Do you want me to kick it off, Ron?
Sure, kick it off, Ken.
Okay. I thought I'd start with a few statistics, and that, as far as adolescents go, there's nothing but statistics. Some of them, sadly, are increasing. But also, it's to be recognized that adolescent issues vary by geography, cultural ideals, religion, socioeconomic things. Death rates are highest among Aboriginal people, and then Black people in North America. I don't know, Jackie, whether it's the same in Oz, but I'm sure it is. Aboriginal people suffer greatly. U.S. has the highest rate of death by firearms of adolescents. Obesity is an increasing risk. 80% of people who are obese at age 18 will be obese for the rest of their lives, which is a sad thing, and it's something we need to recognize, and if we can, intervene. And poverty, of course, is a prime driver of adolescent problems. Okay, Ron, you kick in something.
Well, you just triggered something in my mind, Ken, about childhood obesity. And I'm old enough to remember my teen years yet, but remember raising my children. And when we had our three children, most department stores, you could get slim jeans for our kids. And there were very few places where you could get Huskies. Now it's just the opposite. It's the reverse. And you look around, and I drive kids around for an after-school daycare, and I watch kids come out of school, and I see a lot of them that are obese. And the numbers are staggering. And it just, I guess the question always goes back to the one we did a few months ago of the why. Why has that changed so dramatically in just a really short period of time in my lifetime? We've seen the history of life go from a rural agricultural to now a modern day. Most people living in the city, they think they get the groceries from the grocery store. They don't know it comes from a farm, which is really quite interesting. And I think another big issue beside the obesity thing, and it kind of contributes to it, I think, as well, is today we see so many kids that are addicted to their devices. Everyone walked, we walked 4.5 miles today, and we walked through a college campus here in Holland, and everybody's walking down the street like this, talking on their cell phones or looking on their cell phones. And just that exposure to the radiation that comes from that is really changing how teenagers and prepubescent children really are dealing or having to deal with the onslaught of things that weren't even there 25 years ago. So I think we've got some big challenges, and I know you've got a lot more you could talk about there too, Ken.
Well, and interesting that you bring up how kids were slimmer 30, 40 years ago. And I'm just preparing a PowerPoint for a health expo on Saturday here. And part of it is answering that question. Often we'll hear people use the excuse that it's their genetics. But our genetics haven't changed materially for a couple of thousand years. It takes a very long time to alter your actual genetics. There is, however, a field called epigenetics, and I've discussed that before, where your environment changes the expression of various genes in your body, and your body in an attempt to adapt to a different environment expresses different genes that help you cope, but they come with side effects, and they shorten our lives, and they cause illness in the end. It's a coping mechanism. And so we are not genetically larger, fatter than we used to be. We are epigenetically so because of what's in our environment. I wrote down, what is the recipe for adolescence? I mean, that's a difficult time. It's a troublesome time. So you have young people suddenly flooded with sex hormones. They're under a lot of stress for any number of reasons, peer pressure, you name it. And to relate back to the video that Debbie posted, which was an excellent video on sugar and serotonin levels, kids start trying to feel better in their head, and they use sugar. And sugar's kind of a gateway drug to worse things. So if we can modify that, kids are searching for their personal identity. We all did that. And I'm sure all of us can tell stories about that. We need to belong to some kind of a peer group to identify. And we all try different modes of our personality. It's almost like trying on clothes to see which fit and who we are. The brain is immature. The sex hormones activate emotional and social centers in the brain and really get them going. And that's why they're so emotional and so dependent on their social sphere. However, risk-taking activities, our understanding of risk doesn't mature until we're into our 20s. So here you are, you're emotionally and socially driven, you have poor ability to assess risk. And by the way, that's similar in a lot of mammals. The young adolescents are kind of sacrificial in some ways. They go out and experiment with their environment in case they can find a new and better way, but some of them are statistics along the way. And the risk-taking takes place as sexual things, physical activities, braveness activities, now accentuated by GoPros and YouTube, criminal activities, the peer group identity that comes with those, and chemical and drug use. And it's just experimental risk-taking activities. They don't have much sense of the consequences. And so they get blindsided, and how we can help them through that is very important. And I'd like to see a show of hands of anyone there who doesn't have war wounds from adolescence. I think we all have some. Ron?
You know, a couple of things I just jotted down here. You talk about the genetics or epigenetics, and I remember a discussion we had in one of the classes I was in. We talked about how you could take a person from the Middle East who grew up drinking goat milk and eating dates and figs and pretty much a grain diet from that area. And you could switch that diet with someone living in the northern Alaskan area, maybe the people, the Inuits, I think I'm saying that correctly. Anyway, Inuits, that's the word I'm looking for. And, you know, they're living on whale blubber. They have no fresh vegetables up there in the Arctic Circle. So if you take and switch those two diets, within 6 months, probably both will be dead because they're not genetically ready to receive that kind of nutrition, or lack thereof might be a better way of describing it. So that's a critical thing too. Another thing, you talked about the sugar and Debbie's post on the sugar and how that is a gateway. And I believe with all my heart that we've seen an explosion in the drug and alcohol abuse, and particularly alcohol, because of the high consumption of sugar. That wasn't the case when I was a kid growing up. We saw some kids out there drinking, but they weren't going around plastered. There wasn't the alcoholism that we see today. And the best way to get a buzz, the quickest way, is alcohol. I mean, that goes right to the bloodstream right now. So, I mean, it's a gateway. And then when you're inebriated, then somebody offers you something else maybe in a setting that, well, God, we got to try that. And then we're into soft drugs, and then that leads to harder drugs. And, the minds of teenagers and prepubescent children have not developed far enough to make those rational decisions. And then we get into the whole issue of bullying that occurs in that range. And I remember being bullied, so there's nothing new about that. But I think it's a whole lot more today because of social media. We see bullying can happen in so many ways that never occurred. I got bullied because I was a left-hander and I didn't have a glove for playing baseball. And I had to catch the ball with a right-hander's glove, take the ball out of my hand, put it under my arm, switch hands, and throw it in. Well, the guy had an inside home run and should have been an out at first base because I couldn't throw the ball. So I got bullied for being left-handed. Now, that was a positive. At least I turned it into a positive because it made me a better athlete, made me want to perform. But I think all of those things are such pressure on minds that aren't developed. And today, we're not getting them developed because we're eating foods that don't really qualify as foods. There's no nutrient value left anymore in most of the foods that are being consumed in the grocery store. And a good example of that, and it's around the world, Cheerios and the glyphosate. And I walk into the daycare, and what do they get for a snack when they get out of school? A bowl of cereal, Cheerios. So we're pumping that into kids that are kindergarten through sixth grade, where I happen to be employed. But that's setting them up for those teen years where all these things are changing. And I think it's a big, big challenge.
It's you just made me think of mood-altering foods. That's where it begins. And it's, I think we talked about it when we were talking about infants, but seeing a baby being pacified with Cheerios, you're looking at GMO oats with that Roundup residue being gummed on by a baby, and their salivary amylase turning those oats to sugar in their mouth, which bombards their liver, but it pushes their happy button. And so from a very young age, that is one of our happy buttons. And it's quite obvious that adolescents are going to look for other things to push their happy button. So I asked myself, what do we have to offer? And I think those of us that are parents, how do we improve that adolescence journey to adulthood? We all relate to it. It was a difficult journey. And I think the most profound thing is our personal actions and our own integrity as adults and the adults around those people. There's an interesting fable about a sculptor who was disciplining his child. And the son said, well, Dad, you do this stuff. And why shouldn't I? And the sculptor said, well, come out into my studio. And he showed the son a sculpture that he was almost finished and said to his son, this is like me. I'm pretty much formed. A lot of those bad habits are locked in. And then he led his son over to a raw chunk of marble and said, this is like you. You're not complete. You have the potential for being so much more. And I think that's how we should see them and boost them any way we can. And the word discipline comes from the word disciple. And one of the definitions of that is to follow. And you can't push adolescents, but you can set an example that they would choose to follow. And I think that is probably the most important thing. And that includes the food, the drugs in your medicine cabinet, the exercise. You go mountain biking with them, you go kayaking, you do stuff with them. A friend of mine built a race car with his adolescent son, and he was the pit crew and the mechanic, and the kid raced the car, and they go. And there was no problem in that adolescent's life. Ron, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, one of my favorite sayings is, and people in my small Bible study group know it very well, and when I open my mouth, they almost know what's coming out. There's a saying that says, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. And I think that's very apropos as to how we should live our lives as examples to our children, our grandchildren, even our great-grandchildren. What they see us do, they will try to mimic because they want to please us. So when I see my great-granddaughter with a face in a nice avocado, I'm a happy, happy camper.
There's a Zen parable that parallels that one that says how you do anything is how you do everything. So if your closet's a mess and your car's a mess and there's dishes in the sink and there's dust bunnies everywhere, that's your life. That's your life. And everything that you clean up is going to show and manifest. So attention to those things. And people notice whether that's obvious or not. So attention to those little things in our lives.
If I can say to both of you what I'm gathering from even what we've just been discussing and hearing from both of you there is that the disconnection that our teenagers and our young adults have through technology, that's a really big problem for us because we've disengaged from the human touch, you know, the human interaction that we have. And that reason being is because they have technology at their fingertips, whether it be the computer, whether it be the phone, whether it be the iPad, whatever it may be, they're looking for that stimulus outside of the family unit. And that's where the disconnection, they're not communicating. The communication channels are somewhat interfered with, I guess, realistically, like there's a problem there. And that creates bigger problems because they're not listening to what their parents are trying to guide them through because they're getting external information. And there's so much wrong information, I believe, that they're exposed through the internet. But I also want to, from what you both have been saying in regards to what the recipe is and what's happening with teenagers and young adults, there's one big one that I think that you could both even touch on is mental health, you know, and what happens with, you know, the effects that mental health have on teenagers and young adults because of all of these things that you've already discussed. So I'll hand that back to you both.
Well, depression is so common among teens, and it even before the advent of some of these drugs and some of these other opportunities, depression was not unknown. It's a time that happens. And they need support. They don't need judgment. And the scary thing is that teens are vulnerable to kind of copycat things, and I cannot remember where it was, but somewhere in Polynesia, Jackie, you might be familiar with it, had never experienced a suicide among teens until one boy, upset by splitting up with his girlfriend, committed suicide. And then another one did. And then another one did. And now it is common, really common, and they're losing a lot of youth to that. And I think that's happening in our Aboriginal communities as well. And I believe that's something to do with school shootings as well. It's what they see, and they kind of imitate that. They don't understand it, but they're just drawn to it like a moth to a bulb. And so those are things that I don't know how we can intervene with that other than being there and understanding their mood. But very important. And mental health is huge, Ron. What have you got?
Yeah, and I think so much of that we can relate back to inflammation in the body. You know, we're being bombarded with radio waves from our smartphones, which is scary. I mean, if you go onto YouTube and look at 5G and do any research into 5G and what 4G does. We started out with 1G, 2G. I watched a short video on that the other day, and as an adult, it frightens the daylight out of me to see what's going to happen to our children and grandchildren, or even us as they go within the next year or so to 5G, because it's the internet of everything. So we've got constant radiation bombarding us, and radiation is heat. It is cooking us. So that's inflammation. So what do we have as a product? We've got Emulin. So I think it behooves every single one of us as parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, uncles, aunts. If you know somebody that's not on Emulin, they should be on Emulin because of what it's going to do for reducing inflammation in the body regardless of cause. Now, what we can live through in our lives is our passion for what the causes are. And we all have our different little bents as to where we want to go with that. And we want to be as encompassing as possible on all of that, because it does go back to food, because food really, really changed in my lifetime, and it's not a good thing. We see the depletion of nutrients. We see all the adding of the chemicals and the excitotoxins that going into our kids' brains. And why do we have depression? It's pretty simple to figure that out. It doesn't take a rocket scientist or somebody with a PhD from a college saying you're depressed. I can get depressed too if something happens like what we're having going on right now in the North Carolina, South Carolina. That's depressing. But that's a temporary condition caused by external things that we don't have control over. We've got control over what we tell our kids to eat, suggest they eat, or buy. If it's not in the house, they can't have it. Now, if they're old enough to get in the car and go to McDonald's, well, that's another thing. But I think we've got control. We got to take control very, very early. I've got a grandson who's 21 years old, and he does not drink soda. Now, that is so unusual to not like it. He won't drink it. And I don't know. I like to think I got a little bit to do with that. But anyway, I think we've got to look at depression as being an inflammatory thing. And what we've got, too, that I think is critical with the climax, when we've got kids that are really developing all these hormones and going into maturity, women producing eggs, and what are we doing? We're carrying cell phones, smartphones with this radiation. Where do we carry them? Pockets on the lower body, right next to all the family jewels, if there's going to be a family. And I'll tell you, years and years ago already, when I was in practice, I was seeing couples, not due to the cell phones, but due to nutritional deficiencies, the inability to conceive because sperm counts are down. And women just were not able to conceive. So, we start to ask why, and we look at their hormone profile, and we see some big challenges. And then we find out what they're eating or not eating, and we see why. And I shared this with Ken the other day, a lady that came to me quite a few years ago already, and I had met her when she was about 42 years of age. She'd been in a car wreck at 21, had a problem with her neck, and I did some muscle manipulation and solved that issue. And then I worked with her to help get hormones straightened out. And I hadn't talked to her in probably 15 years. And I saw her on Facebook the other day, and I chatted with her. I said, "You got time for a phone call?" She said, "Sure." She told me that she now has a young daughter, married, and living a good lifestyle. And that daughter is because we helped her get her hormones straightened out. So I had not known that. And this girl has really got a productive, healthy life involved in her well-being as well. So the mother's healthier. So what we say does matter. Sometimes we think we're talking to brick walls, but I think we just got to keep talking, and some of those bricks may come alive.
I'll add to that, Ron, with regard to the screens, because of course we're treating a lot of kids for discomfort from the posture that they're in. We call it text neck, but also what's on those screens. There's a lot of very violent video games. There's a lot of flashing lights, which are neuroexcitatory. They stimulate, you can produce a migraine with those. And so they get a lot of that, and a lot of it before bed, if there's enough sleep in that adolescent's life. And we know how sleep challenged some of them like to be. And of course, sleep is when you rebuild your body. Sleep is when you scavenge the neurotransmitters of the day, all of the chemicals that you've done through brain and nerve activity. It's also when you scan your body for diseases. It's when you fix bad tissues. It's when you release stem cells. Very important time, that sleep. And I think trying our best to be sure kids get enough sleep is very important. I think activities that bond kids to their parents and form memories, that's what's going to power them through the hard times. And unconditional love. Love without conditions and unconditional forgiveness. Just reading a book right now by Bishop Tutu about forgiveness. And lack of forgiveness can be a very, very stressful thing. And helping our kids through those emotional trials, because they are emotionally very highly active and looking to find their way. So gently helping them through those emotional things. And we know there's going to be rebellion, but I don't believe we should on kids. Should, S-H-O-U-L-D. Not, anyway, we shouldn't should on kids. We shouldn't should on ourselves for that matter. Gentle guidance and acceptance is going to work better.
I have a couple things I'd like to add that just came to mind when you were talking. One of them was an article that I actually posted from psychologytoday.com probably a year or more ago. I posted it on our page, and they were talking about depression, and they actually said depression is an allergic response to the inflammatory process in the brain.
Wow.
And I thought, that really puts it into perspective when you can, look at the rise in depression and the food. The other thing, when it comes to teens, there's that whole fad issue. It's almost like, oh, it's cool to have this diagnosis somehow, or it gives them an excuse for acting bad. And, there was a study done that I read, quite some time ago. And the bottom line was there is no diagnosis for depression. There's no blood test. There's no neurological scan. They go by what their symptoms are. Oh, I felt sad yesterday. Today I feel happy. Oh, you have bipolar. It's only given at that title because it's only based on their symptoms. And if everybody's going around saying they're sad, well, then they're going to get labeled as depressed. And then it gives them a category to be in where they feel they belong. And, now I'm like my friends. Or it gives them, again, like an excuse. And so, I think that's a component of it as well. I also have something, I don't know if it will show up, but sorry, I just have this on my phone. It's a little cartoon. We'll see if it'll show up.
Yeah.
What is it?
Isn't that cute? It's like, oh, there's this book. What do we do with this book? So I just thought I'd show that too.
Well, it's interesting. They're talking about kids not being able to tell analog time anymore. They all they're doing is being exposed to the digital way of telling time. So if you show them a clock, you wouldn't even be able to do the Alzheimer's test.
Although, who do we ask when it's time to reset the time on our digital clock?
Yes, indeed.
They're keeping up with technology pretty quickly. I think as far as mood is concerned, I went through this for a while thinking about what can you do for kids. And other than the things that we've already talked about, knowing what I know, I think every kid should be on Amulin and every kid should be on Climax. Climax being a neuromodulator is going to temper those ups and downs. And being is that it assists release dopamine and phenylethylamine, it's going to calm children down, give them some clarity, and they won't need to look for those highs from sugar or perhaps drugs or other things. So were I a parent of an adolescent right now, knowing what I know, I just plain put them on it. Yeah. Say, here's the blue stuff, let's have it together. I feel we better. And have one of these that be put out at dinner time. And that's kind of the bottom line for me.
Yeah. I think too, today we see parents are trying to be like their children rather than being their parents. And there's some misguided things going on in our culture. It's really, I want to be like my kid. I know someone that shouldn't be wearing miniskirts at the age and trying to look like her daughter. That's not a good thing, and I think we need to be the parents, and we need to be the loving parents you're talking about. We got to show them what it is to be like. There's no notebook on how to how to be a parent. We had our first child when I was 20 and Donna was 19. So we didn't have an instruction book. We learned by doing. How did we learn that? From what we saw from our parents doing. And I think a lot of that's being missed today because of our culture. We're seeing so many families that are not together like they were back when I was a child. There was divorce back then, but not anything like it is today. And I see that in the kids that I work with. they're going to different places on different weekends, and the food's different, and I don't like the way this one cooks or that one cooks, and so there's no stability. And I guess that's one of the underlying things that young children and adolescents need to see from us is stability. And if we're not stable because we're trying to act like kids and live our teen years all over when we're in our 40s or 50s, we're making a huge mistake.
There was something said in Desmond Tutu's book about forgiveness that I had never heard or stumbled on before. And it is how parents, if they're struggling, really need to share some of that. Not all of it necessarily, but some, excuse me, some of that with their children, that they're having a hard time, and describe it and take ownership of it. And allow the kids to be a little bit of the adult and say, oh, I get it. And or apologize when they're suddenly angry and say, I'm sorry, I burst out because I'm stressed. We have trouble with, the dog's sick or the whatever, and I'm very concerned and I've had trouble at work today. And you'll probably experience that. I'm just older than you and further down the line. And I think kids will take ownership of their parents in that sense. And I think it's a valuable thing.
It's interesting you're saying that. I'm thinking of my youngest son who was, I think, kindergarten, maybe first grade at the latest, came home one day and he said to Donna, are you and Dad getting a divorce? And Donna says, well, why do you ask that, Ross? He says, well, so-and-so, and I don't remember the kid's name, they're getting a divorce. So I said, well, why? Because they're always fighting. You guys fight, so why aren't you getting a divorce? So they witnessed our challenges. No, we didn't do everything out in front of them, but they saw conflict resolution. And I think too much of that is not occurring anymore in society. We don't know how to deal with it. They got all these safe places to go to. And that's not a good thing. They need to know how to, T-ball, everybody gets a trophy today. There's no winners or losers. And go back to what you were saying, Ken, a little bit ago about the video games and the violence in these games. They're shooting people and then they come back to life. So no big deal. We can do this for real. And the pressure, we just had this past Monday, a student at my granddaughter's school come to school with a pistol. Now that puts stress on my granddaughter. So, it's real. It's there everywhere. So, you hear the background, you listen to the background of most of these kids that you hear about, at least in the States here, they're on some psychotropic drugs. And, why are they on that? You can relate it back to what we're talking about over and over and over again.
Yeah. And to my mind, why would you wait for symptoms to appear before you start working on their health? Why wouldn't you? That's the base of that health pyramid. You get that right, and their health is kind of taken care of, and there will be less symptoms. There'll be less problems to deal with, and things will not compound themselves. So that, to me, is the right approach right from the get-go. And you can't underestimate love. Love is, I wrote an article a while back for a magazine called Vitamin L. Love is unbelievably important. Maybe we talked about that on a different one of our talks, but there was a study out of one of the orphanages, I believe in Hungary, where they studied those children, and they had all the creature comforts. They had decent food, they had light, they had a safe, secure place to sleep. But they didn't get attention, they didn't get love, they didn't get adult attention. And they pretty much universally had mental and emotional trouble for lack of love. So it is just phenomenal how important that is. And you won't get it from a screen. And you won't get it on a screen when you're on a screen and your kid's on a screen and you're texting each other. There's no eye contact, and you can't really express and learn how to both communicate and receive those visual cues from another person, which are very important. And that's why some kids get out of control. I think they're a little bit delayed in their development of interpreting visual clues from other people because they're doing their communicating on a screen.
Yeah, it avoids the human touch. And, we're living, unfortunately, in a culture. I get to work with these kids that are kindergarten through sixth grade. And sometimes they need a little tap on the butt, or sometimes they need a big hug, and you can't do either or. And it's really, really sad because there's no way to show them other than through your words, and those are important, or the smile. And that's really, to me, being the age I am now, my way of giving back to the kids that are coming up, to exhibit who we really are from the inside out, even if we cannot touch them. We do a bunch of fist bumps and we do some high fives and that kind of thing, but a lot of times they just need hugs. And there's a couple of them, they just want to hug you no matter what. So you kind of just stand there with your arms straight by your side and let them hug you. But it's sad that we've come to this point because the human touch is critical to good mental health.
And adolescents will push you away when you hug them, but they're taking it in. And I think most parents understand that.
Do you know both of you, like when you're looking at things, I thought you'd finished. I'm sorry, Ken.
No problem.
And I know you were talking about in regards to people that started taking their life, and you're looking at why it happens, and it seems to have that domino effect. And I know 2 years ago locally here, it was a 16-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 17-year-old, and it all happened within 10 days, all within a space of 10 kilometres. And every single one of those children had loving families, and one of them in particular, her brother actually went into her room to call her in for dinner, ready for dinner. And her sister had committed suicide in the bedroom next to the family whilst they were there. The other one it wasn't great anyway. One of them was close to home for me, but I look at it and I think that there was nothing wrong in 3 of those families because I knew one extremely well. They were like family, but the other 2, I knew of them. And there was nothing wrong with them. But the big thing that comes through with it now, knowing the more that we do about amylin and Climax, is what they're not getting from their food, that they are eating a lot of fast food. They're still getting what their parents are trying to give to them, but that's not always what they choose themselves, and they don't have control of them when they leave the home. So it's their own choices. And then they have all of this, the mental health that they're dealing with and the stress of the bullying and how they're coping mentally, physically and emotionally, that it is affecting the brain. And I like what you're saying was in regards to Debbie looking at, where was it? It was up here and I wrote it, that depression, it was you, Ken, an allergic response to inflammatory levels in the brain. And you look at that as to why the inflammatory level's there, because the food's feeding the inflammatory levels. And so my question being, it's such a fine line, isn't it? How do we put a document together to be able to give this to parents to open their eyes up? Like, it's just so frustrating because you listen to this and it's so simplistic. The answer's there, the solution's there, and we've got it. But how do we get it out?
Well, not to go back to my stuff, but that health pyramid is basically, you have to look at the base of the health pyramid. One of the big things missing for a lot of kids is exercise. So exercise is an amazing stress release. And they get pent up stress from the day, and if they can blow it out with exercise, especially where they get to hit something. Some psychologists did a study, and they found that the best form of exercise was hitting something, be it a baseball, a squash ball, a soccer ball. And we've all discovered that. We go do a really energetic bout of exercise, and you come home and you just feel kind of good. You secrete endorphins. You feel better. And exercise is indicated for virtually every disease as something very, very beneficial. And that's one of the first places I would go. And I would bet that kids that exercise have a lot less issues than kids that don't. And it's so underrated.
I couldn't agree 100% more than what you're saying, Ken. And, you know, and I'll take it and flip it to the other end of the scale to us as seniors, you know, or retirees. We sit around a lot during the daytime, maybe because we're not active in our jobs or whatever anymore. But Donna and I will notice that if we've had hot weather and it's like 90 and the humidity is way high, we're just not going to go out and suffer through that because it's not even good because you can get dehydrated. So, but if we go a couple of days without walking, we can start to feel depressed. And even if it's just a short walk around the block, just a quarter mile around the block, it really changes how you feel. I can personally notice it when I'm about a mile into my walk, that there's something psychologically that's changing in my brain. You know, first you feel a little, maybe not as flexible, and you get going, and then you feel more flexible, and that energy comes, and you feel good. And then it's like, oh, do we want to go the 3 or the 4 mile? And we usually take the 4 mile because we've changed the chemistry in the body by exercising, and that's not occurring with the bulk of the kids. Now, there's some of them who love to run and they're in sports and they're on the track team, but it's not the majority of them. The majority of them are walking around with the smartphones in their hands and sitting on the couch and eating Doritos and having sticky fingers with that coming into my van.
A few years ago, there was a big study that came out of the U.S. Talking about exercise being the best intervention for depression that there was. But of course, depressed people, it's hard to get them to exercise. About the same time as that, a study came out of Russia where they discovered that actually beating people helped their depression. So another chiropractor and myself suggested we might start a depression clinic where we chase people with sticks. That would be a sure thing. One of the things that I was going to say is that this is a bit of a down subject today, but there are some real bright spots out there. Every day in our clinic, we're getting parents and kids who are eating vegetables, they're exercising, they're doing stuff together. I just had a woman in yesterday, and she's going to do an adventure race, and she's out riding her mountain bike with her 7-year-old, and he's keeping up, and they're bonding, and they're having a good time, and they're laughing, and they're suffering. And there's so many bright spots, and a lot of kids that are eating well. And I applaud those, and I've forgotten whose book it was, but someone said, focus on the bright spots, focus on the people that are doing it right, and learn to do it the way they do it. And I think that's something we could all learn from. So if you've got a neighbor who is exceptionally successful with their kids, think, what are they doing? What are they, what can we do? Is there a way we can apply that to our family?
We need to emulate the positive.
So as we sort of draw, I know, Lee, you were going to ask a question just then. So did you want to ask what it was that you were thinking about?
General observation, Jackie, thank you. When you were talking about the children with their faces in screens all the time, so they're not interacting, if you look around, you see that even from very small ages, children in parks and things with their parents sitting nearby with their faces in their phones, and they're not interacting with the children. And the thing about parenting, especially an adolescent, is that they really give you a tough run sometimes. They'll argue the point with you, and we need to be able to be good parents and ride that out, because giving in to them all the time just teaches them that that bad behaviour is going to reward them, because it does. And I always felt open and frank discussion with my son was the best thing. And he always knew that if he went off somewhere and got himself into trouble, he might get a boot up the backside. But at the same time, he knew that he could call me anytime he got into difficulty and I would come for him. So that's that whole balance we need to find to make our children feel safe, accountable, and resist those times when they want to be difficult. It's about parenting. And sadly, there's not enough of it, I think.
I think part of adolescence is discovering your boundaries.
Yes.
And so you'll push the boundaries.
Exactly.
until they get you. And if you're lucky, they'll get you before you do serious damage. I would hope that every kid who's doing sports or real physical activities has a minor injury that really hurts. And it might make them think twice before they get the GoPro out and do something very dumb.
Yeah.
So the memory of pain is a good lesson. It's a good teacher.
I think kids too, you make some great points there, Lee. I think kids want to know where our limits are as well. They're testing us to see how strongly we believe in what we're telling them. So they're pushing that envelope, and we need to stand firm. And I've had all three of my now adult kids, two in their 50s, one late 40s, come back and say years later, thank you for that being strong in what you believe, because it taught us how far we can go so that they can do that with their children and their grandchildren. So, you know, we lead by example. And I think that's what we need to do in this business, this industry, is lead by example. We need to walk the walk, talk the talk, and Ken's drinking some good water, so that's a good thing. We need turkey water. There you go.
I'd like to say something too, Ken. When you were talking about the orphanage, it reminded me of something I learned many, many years ago that I thought was really fascinating about kids who don't get that stimulation, that are in an orphanage or just in a home where there isn't any of that positive role model. And I think it's by the age of 11, you have dendrites in the brain that they actually get strengthened when there is that interaction and all of that. And at about age 11, there's actually like a neurological, a chemical flush that goes through, and those are then wiped out. You don't get a chance to get those back. So from that point on, if those kids have not, reinforced those dendrites for the positive things, you end up with kids that have no empathy. They can do things wrong and not feel any guilt or shame. And so that's pretty scary, because there's an actual physical, effect, and a neurological effect on the brain that then impacts them for the rest of their lives. You don't get to get those back.
That goes right through to adulthood. I'm currently treating what I would call a tragic case, a woman whose father went through the war in Holland. His father was abusive verbally and beat his son. And now that man beat his children. And this woman was beaten and told she was no good throughout her childhood and adolescence, and treated very cruelly and felt worthless. And she's carried that around for her whole life. And it's caused her so much stress that she has MS, she's got fibromyalgia, she's got weight problems, and it's just compounding itself. And now her husband has just about had all he can deal with her issues, and they're having trouble. And finding a way to snip that cable where you drag around that person who abused you, whatever way, and that's the value of forgiveness and speaking about those things, first of all, but also making sure that in your life with your kids, that those things just don't happen. You don't verbally abuse people, you don't call them bad names, you stay to the high road.
And that's where the trapped emotion release that I've spoken of before really helps, because those things put that emotional energy in the body, and you don't get rid of it just by thinking you're going to get rid of it. It does take an actual process, but those get stuck. They're physically stuck in the body for the rest of their lives and affect them from then on.
To train them up when they're young is such an important thing, because we've seen in our own family, and I can think back, and I don't know the exact time frame, but when the kids are young, you're the hero. That's my dad. That's my mom. And that happens till you get to be about that prepubescent age, and you start to get the hormones, and then the kids walk on the other side of the street away from their parents. And then they get to be 20, 21, 22, and they have babies, and they come back to mom and dad. Hey, how do you deal with this? Because they know we have the answers. So love them through the whole process. Let them know that you're the parent, and I think we do them really good.
Ken and Ron, I just want to say, and for everybody that's on the call, I'm just mindful of the hour that we're heading into, but I would like to try and wrap this up if we can. And one thing that I can, not one thing, there's quite a whole catalyst of things that you've spoken about today, but it all funnels down to quite a few very important things, and that is in the regards to environmentally what our children are exposed to, and then leading into their teenage years and their young adult years, what they're feeding, what they're being fed, and what they choose to eat themselves as they do get older, and the effects that that's having on them, how we can support them as families and as parents, uncles, aunts, the exposure that they have physically, mentally and emotionally. But I'm also going to put in there that all of us on this call are very much aware, because I want this to be placed out into the big wide world in the web, the benefits of what Climax and what Emulin can do in reducing those inflammatory levels and supporting their diets with the important minerals and nutrients that they're not getting from their foods that Emulin's able to support them with. And then, of course, we've got Climax on top of that as a superfood to help them on many levels as well with their health, that hopefully people will listen to this call and realise what sort of, I believe I'm going to call it a crisis that we have as we've moved forward, because our children, our teenagers, our young adults are exposed to so much more than what we were with, and the statistics are so alarming in the wrong areas. So I'd like to thank both of you. I don't know if either of you would like to finish this call off with any final thoughts before we do. Ron?
I think I just said it.
Ken?
I'm surprised that we went the whole hour, because Ron and I talked earlier and we said there's not that much to talk about, and we feel a little bit like we've said it all.
Yeah.
And so more to know.
It's been a very, very, to a degree, even sometimes alarming, because they're things that we know about, but it makes you have goosebumps. It even had me a bit teary in some areas, because you can resonate with it because you've had some sort of association to some of these areas that you've spoken about, whether it be yourself or whether it be people that you know of. Yes, Brian?
Yeah, just one thing, like everybody here knows that my wife and I are foster parents. And the damage that we're seeing with kids coming in at 3.5, 4, 5, and 6 years old, if you actually saw it and knew it, it'd blow your mind. And it just keeps progressively getting worse. And then these kids, when they're 16, 17, 18, are starting to reproduce too. And the cycle doesn't stop. Now, what can be done? I don't know, but something like, we've had 75 kids in our home over the last 12 or 14 years. And like, we see some of the kids, well, I know there's 4 of them are in prison long term. There's 2 or 3 others that have been adopted out, which was good. But the damage that is done to these kids are like, they drop out at grade 9 or 10, and there's nothing for them. They're into drugs, and now marijuana is becoming legal in another month, and that's going to be horrendous when that gets underway, because they don't know what the ramifications are going to be on it.
I think, like Ken said, he said it well, vitamin love.
Yeah.
Just such a vicious cycle, isn't it? We've got such a lot to contend with, and children do, and that's why, I really am very, very grateful, and I know all of us are, to both yourself, Ken, and to you, Ron, for bringing this topic up, and then, really delving into some really raw areas, but they're very real areas that we're confronted with on a daily basis as parents, as grandparents, as uncles, as aunts, as neighbours, whatever it may be. But as a community, it's not that difficult to reach out and show an act of kindness and smile at somebody. Even a smile can lift somebody's moods up, and people are too scared to even smile at someone these days because they think somebody wants something from them. And we're so disconnected. I think that's the big thing. You see, we're just so disconnected through technology. And if we can try and do that, try and turn that cycle around, And of course, I'm going to keep singing that praise of Emulin and Cloax because I know it makes a huge difference. So on that note, I do want to finish. We are an hour. We're heading on the hour. So I want to thank both Ken and Ron very, very much for what you've brought to the table for us today. It's a very important platform that we're all very aware of the future. It's a platform of future with our children, our teenagers, our young adults that are going to produce our grandchildren. And we want to make sure that that cycle of life continues in the best possible manner that we can possibly provide. So thank you to both of you. I want to thank both of my co-hosts, Debbie Ward and Lee Rafferty. And I want to thank everybody else that's come onto the call today. And then also for everyone that listens to this call afterwards, I hope that you really find it beneficial and you reach out to both Ken and Ron, message them and thank them because you guys are both invaluable. You really are. So I just want to thank you both and thank everybody today.
Thanks, guys. Big time.
Thank you, guys.
Happy Talk Like a Pirates Day.
Arr.
Arr,
I'm going to,
ladies.
and you're allowed to have fun on these calls. This is what you're missing out on when you don't come onto them.
Our address is 147 Pirates Lane. The island that we live on. And people ask me for my postal code, and it is V9R6R1.
And you're never going to believe this, people. This man actually has a doctorate in front of his name. And I'm going to finish it on that note. So I'll just finalise it and we'll speak to you next week. Bye, everybody. Good afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Good morning.